Her millionaire arrived home earlier than usual and heard his wife say, "I already put poison in his glass and one day he will be dead." Hours later, the millionaire decided to switch the glasses and everyone was shocked by what happened. The city's sun was already shining through the enormous windows of the Lockwood mansion when Beatrice Aldridge de Lockwood decided to have her breakfast. The golden light crossed the white linen curtains, casting delicate shadows on the carved wooden furniture that adorned the adjacent living room. At 75 years old, the family matriarch still maintained an elegant posture, a reflection of the years when she was one of the great ladies of Mexican society. Her silver hair, always impeccably arranged in a low bun, matched the light blue silk ensemble she wore that morning, carefully ironed by the housekeeper. Her hands, marked by time but still graceful, trembled slightly as she held the English porcelain cup adorned with golden details and small blue flowers. Beatrice tried to ignore the knot that formed in her stomach every time she had to face another day in that house which, although it had been hers for over 50 years, now seemed a minefield of tensions and unspoken fears. In the immense kitchen, which looked like it came straight out of an architecture magazine, the Italian marble floor shone in the sunlight, reflecting the luxury that permeated every corner of that house. The black granite counters were polished to the point of mirroring the carefully arranged utensils. The family's antique silverware, neatly organized on a white linen tablecloth, seemed a relic of better times when that kitchen was the vibrant heart of the house. Beatrice sighed, recalling the days when laughter echoed through those walls and meals were a moment of family unity. Now she preferred to come down earlier, taking advantage of the few moments of peace before the rest of the house awoke. "Ambrose always says I need to eat better," she thought, looking at the bread with butter left on the porcelain plate. Her desire to eat was almost non-existent, but she knew that Nora, the loyal housekeeper, would be hurt if she left the breakfast untouched. The quiet tranquility of the morning was abruptly interrupted by the sound of high heels echoing against the marble, a symphony of control and imposition that Bice knew well. Sabrina, her daughter-in-law, entered the kitchen as if strutting down a catwalk, her presence filling the room with a mix of glamour and tension. Nearly 6 foot tall, the woman was the personification of mod Mexican beauty. Her perfectly straightened and shiny black hair framed her immaculately made-up face. She wore a tight red dress that seemed more appropriate for an evening event than a family breakfast. The jewelry she wore, discreet but clearly expensive, caught the light in a way that highlighted her elegance, as if she knew every move was being watched. "Darling, why are you eating alone?" Sabrina's melodious voice cut the air, laced with a rehearsed sweetness that made Beatrice cringe internally. That rhetorical question wasn't seeking an answer, only the reaffirmation of her superiority. Before Beatrice could respond, Sabrina raised her voice, now almost theatrical. "Ambrose, come see your mother having breakfast alone in the kitchen." Her intonation was carefully calculated to sound like genuine concern, but Beatrice knew it was just another scene for her son. It didn't take long for Ambrose Lockwood to enter the kitchen, his firm steps echoing down the hallway before he appeared in the doorway. At 45 years old, Ambrose was the living image of the success that Sabrina loved to display. Tall like his father, with slightly graying black hair at the temples and a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, he radiated confidence and efficiency. His brown eyes, identical to his mother's, shone with sincere concern as he looked at Beatrice. "Mom, why didn't you let us know? Sabrina always insists that we have breakfast together," he said, adjusting his tie as he approached. His voice had a caring tone, but Beatrice knew he was blind to the reality happening around him. "I didn't want to bother," she mumbled, avoiding meeting her son's eyes. Sabrina's watchful, predatory gaze made her stomach churn. Before she could say anything else, Sabrina stepped forward and enveloped her mother-in-law in an embrace. To Ambrose, the gesture seemed an act of affection, but to Beatrice it was like being surrounded by thorns. Sabrina whispered in the elderly woman's ear with a flawless smile that concealed her true intention. "Always so humble, isn't it? But remember, times have changed." Ambrose's cell phone began to ring, an insistent melody that interrupted the moment and brought temporary relief to Beatrice. "It's the office, I need to take this," he said, hurriedly leaving the kitchen while adjusting the expensive watch on his wrist. Beatrice felt a wave of relief and dread simultaneously. Ambrose's absence meant she would be alone with Sabrina, a prospect that made her skin crawl. As soon as Ambrose left the kitchen, Sabrina's mask fell off, leaning over her mother-in-law. Her red lips moved close to the elderly woman's ear, and her voice, now icy and cutting, spoke softly. "Meddling old woman," Sabrina whispered in Beatrice's ear, her warm breath making the elder shudder. "Next time I catch you in this kitchen, you won't just be eating in the servants' quarters. Who knows, maybe I'll send you straight to the most miserable public nursing home I can find, those where the elderly are forgotten and mistreated. It would be perfect for you. Or better yet, how about going a few days without food? They say at your age hunger can cause so much mental confusion." Ambrose would be so worried to see his mommy wasting away, losing her memory. "Now get out of my sight before I lose my patience." Beatrice froze, her heart pounding erratically. She wanted to respond, but her throat seemed dry and powerless. She felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, unable to defend herself or escape. The tension was interrupted by the arrival of Evangeline, the 8-year-old granddaughter who entered the kitchen skipping with an impeccable school uniform and white bows holding her black hair. The girl's innocent smile was a sight that should have brought comfort, but the words that came out of her mouth quickly dissipated any hope of peace. Grandma, didn't Mom say old people can't eat in the main kitchen? Her childlike voice carried the same venom that Beatrick so feared in her. The elderly woman felt a pang in her heart as she realized how the mother's cruelty was already beginning to poison the daughter's innocence. Beatrick brought her hand to her chest, trying to control her breathing that now seemed to escape her control. She felt suffocated, as if the air in the kitchen had become rarefied. The porcelain cup in her hand slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering on the floor with a sound that seemed to amplify the tension in the room. The noise made Nora, the 8-year-old housekeeper, rush into the kitchen. Mrs. Beatrick, what happened? Exclaimed Nora, her eyes filling with genuine concern as she saw the state of her employer. Before Sabrina could intervene, Nora ran towards Beatrick, placing her hand on her back to support her. Mr. Ambrose, come quickly. Mrs. Beatrick is feeling unwell, shouted the housekeeper, her voice laden with desperation. Evangeline watched the scene with morbid curiosity while Sabrina remained motionless, her arms crossed and a discreet smile on her red lips as if enjoying a show. Ambrose rushed into the kitchen, his eyes wide as he saw his hunched-over mother trying to catch her breath. Mom, what happened? He knelt beside her, firmly holding her hands while Nora was already looking for something to help the elderly woman. Beatrice, with blurred vision and fading strength, managed to glimpse the expression of satisfaction on Sabrina's lips before her consciousness began to fail. The last thing she saw was Nora's look of genuine concern, something she had long since stopped receiving from her own family. The luxurious room at San Angel Hospital was a refuge for few, a space that combined comfort and cutting-edge technology. The soft beige walls were decorated with discreet landscape paintings chosen to convey serenity. The floor was covered in light wood, an elegant contrast with the modern medical equipment, which flashed discreet lights and emitted rhythmic sounds. The hospital bed, more like a high-end adjustable armchair, had immaculate white sheets folded with precision. Beatrick Aldridge Lockwood rested there, her frail body enveloped by that luxurious setting. However, the sophisticated environment was not enough to calm the tremor in her hands or the constant tightness in her chest. The doctor had left a short while ago after assuring that the malaise was not serious, just a spike in blood pressure caused by stress. The news, far from bringing relief, deepened Beatrice's anxiety. How could she explain that the real reason for her discomfort was the constant tension she lived in? What she was facing was not something that medicines or consultations could cure. The footsteps in the hallway, unmistakable to Beatrick, sounded like an announcement of more tension. Ambrose, her son, entered first, his firm stride betraying haste and concern. Tall and imposing in his navy blue suit, Ambrose was the personification of a successful businessman. "Mom, how are you feeling?" he asked immediately, crossing the room quickly. Before she could answer, Sabrina appeared right behind him. The daughter-in-law looked like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine, her sleek black hair styled to perfection and her cream-colored, body-hugging dress contrasting with the room's simplicity. Even after hours of waiting, Sabrina maintained her impeccable poise, as if she were never caught off guard. Nora, the faithful housekeeper, entered next. Although discreetly positioned at the door, the woman's kind eyes missed nothing. They soon settled on Beatrick, filled with genuine concern, a gesture that briefly comforted the matriarch. Finally, Evangeline emerged, skipping, a stark contrast between childlike energy and the charged atmosphere of the room. The girl, impeccable with her black hair tied in bows, had the same astute look as her mother. "It was just a scare, thank God," said Ambrose, sitting down beside his mother. He gently took her hand, his eyes reflecting the love he felt for her. Beatrick wanted to smile, to reassure him, but the weight of her reality prevented her. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll take care of everything so you can rest. You don't need to stress about anything." The words were an empty comfort. How could she rest, knowing that the greatest danger was right there by her side? Sabrina, keeping her sweet tone, leaned in slightly as if studying Beatrick carefully. "Mother-in-law, you really need to take better care of your health. We're all worried about you, isn't that right, Ambrose?" Her voice was soft, but Beatrick felt the subtext like a cold blade. "So much stress isn't good at your age. Evangeline, come tell Grandma to take care of herself," she called, encouraging her daughter to approach. Evangeline smiled, a gesture that should have warmed Beatrice's heart but carried a tone of learned defiance. "Old people are like that," Evangeline said, her childlike tone masking cruelty.
They get sick over anything, don't they, Grandma? It must be so annoying to be old and weak.
The statement was uttered with a disturbing naturalness, as if it were an absolute truth. Nora, in the background, brought her hand to her mouth, unable to hide her indignation, while Sabrina smiled discreetly as if her daughter's attitude were a personal triumph. Ambrose, seemingly oblivious to the weight of those words, looked at the watch on his wrist. "Mom, I'll go to the cafeteria to get you something to eat."
"Nora, can you come with us?"
"Evangeline, come with Daddy," he suggested, his voice practical and innocent. Beatrice froze. Being alone with Sabrina was her worst nightmare. As always, Sabrina knew how to adapt to the moment.
"Of course, darling. I'll stay and keep your mother company. I don't want her to feel alone."
Her smile was impeccable, but Beatrice shivered as she noticed the predatory gleam in her eyes. Ambrose nodded, oblivious to what was happening around him, and left with Nora and Evangeline. The governess cast one last look at Beatrice before leaving, but her expression was one of helplessness.
As soon as the door closed, Sabrina abandoned her mask.
She walked slowly towards the bed, her heels echoing through the room. Each step seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Beatrice tried not to shrink back, but the strength in her body seemed to drain away. When Sabrina stopped beside the bed, leaning in slightly, her black eyes shone with malice. "Listen carefully, you meddling old woman," Sabrina said, her voice turning to pure venom as she leaned over the hospital bed. "If you open that withered mouth of yours to tell anyone about our little incident in the kitchen, I promise high blood pressure will be the least of your problems."
"You know those pills you take every night?"
"It would be a shame if they were switched for something stronger. Or maybe I'll need to remind Ambrose how your memory has been failing lately."
"Who do you think he'll believe, his devoted wife or the senile old woman who can barely remember where she left her glasses?" Her perfectly manicured fingers tightened on Beatrice's arm. "And don't think Nora can help you. One phone call from me, and that miserable family of hers will be out on the street."
"You have no idea what I'm capable of, mother-in-law.
And believe me, I'd love to have a reason to show you."
The threatening tone was so real that Beatrice had to hold on to the bed to keep from trembling even more. She wanted to respond, but the words fled her mouth. Her heart was pounding erratically, and she feared Sabrina could hear the sound.
However, a slight noise from the door caught the attention of both women.
Nora, who had silently returned to retrieve her forgotten purse, stood in the partially open doorway. Her eyes were wide as she witnessed the scene. The shock on her face was evident, but not as much as the fear that crossed it when Sabrina turned around.
Sabrina remained calm, but her gaze now directed at Nora had the intensity of a predator.
"Nora, dear," she said, reverting to her sweet tone.
"Why don't you go help Ambrose with the coffee? You know how he likes it when you pick something special for his mother."
The governess hesitated, her purse clutched in her trembling hands. She looked at Beatrice, who avoided her gaze and knew she had no choice.
As Nora walked away, Sabrina didn't miss the opportunity to deliver one last veiled threat.
"Oh, and Nora," her sweet voice now tinged with venom, "you know that little house where your family lives?
It would be a shame if something happened to the contract, don't you think?"
The sound of the closing door was like a final sentence. Hours later, the return to the Lockwood mansion was shrouded in a silence so dense it seemed to suffocate the car's occupants. The golden light of the Mexican late afternoon, which normally tinted the marble walls with welcoming hues, now cast disquieting shadows as if reflecting the growing tension.
Beatrice, still weakened from the hospital episode, walked slowly into the house, leaning on Nora.
Their footsteps echoed through the luxurious corridors, each sound reverberating like a countdown to something terrible. Ambrose, distracted by messages on his phone, went straight to his office, delegating his mother's care to his wife and the governess, a decision that filled the two women remaining at Beatrice's side with apprehension. The Lockwood mansion, a true architectural masterpiece, seemed like a palace. The Italian marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and the high walls displayed paintings by renowned Mexican artists. However, what was once a symbol of grandeur and family unity now seemed like a prison. Each luxurious detail transformed into a cruel reminder of the inequality and power dynamics that dominated that house. Sabrina walked behind them, her heels marking a deliberate rhythm against the marble, as if each beat was a reminder of her authority. The woman carried herself like a queen in her domain, every move rehearsed to intimidate and control. She wore a tight red dress that, in the late afternoon light, seemed to acquire the hue of fresh blood. Her black hair, perfectly aligned, fell like a frame around her flawlessly made-up face. But it was her eyes that carried the true weight of the scene, two dark pools that watched Beatrice and Nora with predatory intensity. As they reached the long corridor leading to Beatrice's quarters, the tension became palpable. Nora, who walked beside the matriarch, noticed that her own hands were trembling as she held her employer's arm. She tried to remain strong, but the fear was evident on her face. In decades of service to the family, Nora had never felt such dread for herself or Beatrice. She knew that any misstep could mean not only her own ruin but that of her entire family, who depended on the job and housing provided by the Lockwoods. Sabrina stopped beside them, watching like a cat playing with its prey. The already heavy atmosphere grew even more oppressive when she finally spoke, her voice as sweet as honey but laced with venom. "Nora, dear," she began, approaching with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You know, dear Nora," Sabrina drew closer, like a feline circling its prey, her voice dripping with sweet venom. "I've been thinking about that humble little house where your family is living. The one my husband, out of pity, granted you. How many grandchildren do you have again? 5? 6? All so little. It would be a true tragedy if they ended up on the street, wouldn't it? Or worse, imagine an anonymous report about elder abuse reaching social services right when your daughter is asking for custody of the children. And you know how cruel the system is to poor families." She adjusted a lock of hair with false casualness. "But I'm sure you're intelligent enough to keep your mouth shut. After all, we wouldn't want anything bad to happen to those innocent little children, would we?" She emphasized the words with an almost possessive tone, each syllable piercing the governess's heart like a knife. Nora stopped in her place, feeling her legs weaken under the weight of terror. Her hands, calloused by decades of faithful service to the Lockwood family, tightened their grip on Beatrice's arm, like a castaway seeking salvation. The gray uniform, which she had always kept immaculate with such pride, now seemed to suffocate her. "Please, Mrs. Sabrina," she whispered, her voice shattering like broken crystal. "My grandchildren, they're just little kids. The youngest is only 3 years old. He needs his asthma medicine." Tears began to stream down her aged face as she continued. "My daughter is pregnant, alone. That house is all we have. Have mercy." Nora fell to her knees, decades of dignity forgotten in the face of the terror of seeing her family on the streets. "We have served your family for 3 generations. My mother raised Don Ambrose. I practically raised Evangeline." Her voice faltered as she saw the cruel pleasure in Sabrina's eyes. "Please. I'll do anything." Sabrina savored every second of that humiliation, as if it were a fine wine. Her smile widened with each plea, each tear shed. She slowly approached Nora, her heels marking a cruel rhythm against the floor. "Anything?" she asked with false sweetness, leaning down to lift the governess's chin with a perfectly manicured finger. "Then I suggest you keep that mouth of yours shut. Or your precious family will find out what it's like to live under a bridge." Turning to Beatrice, Sabrina stepped forward, further reducing the space between them. "And you, mother-in-law," she said, leaning slightly. Sabrina whispered with a smug smile, leaning over Beatrice, "After so much stress, I think you really need a special little sleeping remedy. You know, I've been researching medications for the elderly. It's amazing how some are so strong they can leave a person sleeping for days. And the most interesting part is that some can even cause permanent mental confusion. Imagine you sleeping so deeply that you couldn't even tell Ambrose about our little chats. Or better yet, waking up so confused that no one would believe a single word you say. Wouldn't it be good to rest a bit, mother-in-law?" A very deep sleep. The veiled threat made Beatrice clutch the stair railing beside her, desperately seeking some stability. Evangeline's arrival, as if choreographed, further amplified the discomfort of the moment. The girl seemed a reflection of her mother, both in appearance and behavior. Approaching with light steps, she smiled at her grandmother, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. "Mom, can I give Grandma her medicine today?" she asked with a frightening sweetness, her childish voice perfectly masking the cruelty contained in her words.
Beatrice felt her blood run cold. What else had the child learned from her mother? Sabrina let out a low laugh, brimming with pride. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and replied, "Of course, my love. Who knows? One day you might help Mommy with everything in this house too." The words were spoken as a joke, but Beatrice knew each one carried a purpose. The sound of approaching male footsteps broke the moment. Ambrose, followed by Graham, a guest Beatrice recognized from previous dinners, entered the hallway. "Darling, where are you?" "Graham just arrived," Ambrose's voice echoed through the space, full of animation.
Upon hearing the man's name, Sabrina lifted her head with a glint in her eyes that Beatrice immediately recognized. It was a different kind of interest, one she wished she hadn't noticed. Quickly, Sabrina adjusted her posture like an actress entering the scene. The transformation was instant. The cruel look disappeared, replaced by a warm smile and the demeanor of a devoted wife. "We're here, dear," she responded with a melodious voice, walking gracefully toward the men. The contrast between her attitude seconds before and her new persona was so great that Beatrice felt a knot forming in her throat. Nora, seizing the distraction, tried to guide Beatrice to her room, but before they could move away, Sabrina intercepted them with an almost imperceptible gesture.
No, all together. After all, we're a family, aren't we?"
Her words carried the force of an order.
Beatrice tried to protest but couldn't find her voice.
Evangeline clapped her hands, excited by the idea.
To any outside observer, it seemed a harmonious scene of a happy family. As Ambrose and Graham's footsteps drew nearer, Nora tried once more to protect her mistress. "Mrs. Beatrice is still very tired.
Perhaps she should rest a bit before lunch," she said, her voice cautious. Sabrina shot a look at the governess that seemed capable of freezing the air around her. "Nonsense," she replied with artificial sweetness. "She'll love the company, and Graham has always been so close to the family." The emphasis on close was laden with other intentions, something Nora immediately noticed, and it made her skin crawl. Beatrice remained motionless as Sabrina approached Graham. He was a tall man with gray hair, dressed in calculated casualness that denoted his wealth.
"Dear Graham,"
Sabrina exclaimed, her voice overflowing with charm.
"How good that you came."
"We were just taking Beatrice to freshen up a bit before lunch." Her smile was warm, but there was a glint in her eyes that only Nora seemed to notice, a look that lingered on Graham for a second longer than appropriate.
As Sabrina led everyone to the dining room, Evangeline took the opportunity to approach her grandmother once more.
"Grandma," the girl whispered, her voice laden with disguised malice, "if you don't behave during lunch, Mom said she'll give you a medicine that will make you sleep all day." The childish tone masked the threat, but the impact on Beatrice was devastating. The matriarch tried to gather strength as she felt the weight of her world crumbling around her.
Graham, oblivious to the family's toxic dynamic, walked calmly beside Ambrose, both commenting on business.
Sabrina, leading the group with Evangeline in tow, seemed more powerful than ever. And Nora, ever watchful, stayed one step behind her, vigilant eyes on Beatrice, fearing what else might happen at that fateful lunch.
The Lockwood Mansion's office was an environment that exuded power and sophistication.
The dark mahogany-paneled walls reflected the warm light of an antique lamp, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the high ceiling. The heavy, almost oppressive green velvet curtains were slightly ajar, allowing the last glimmer of the Mexican afternoon to enter through the French windows. The wide, waxed floorboards creaked softly under the footsteps of anyone daring to cross that space. The central desk, a massive mahogany piece with bronze details, was impeccably organized, except for a brown envelope that seemed to carry the weight of a forbidden secret. Graham Caldwell, always impeccable in his dark gray Italian suit, was leaning over the desk. His graying hair, meticulously combed, glistened under the dim light, while his calculated smile gave him an almost unshakable appearance of confidence. But there was something in his gaze, a glimmer of ambition that betrayed the superficial calm. Seated there, he seemed more like an actor rehearsing his performance than a man at ease. Lunch had ended minutes before, and Ambrose, distracted with his business, hurried away for a video conference. This interval was the moment Sabrina and Graham had been waiting for. As soon as Ambrose disappeared upstairs, Sabrina closed the office door behind her with a soft click that sounded loud in the silence. The sound of the lock resonated through the room like the first sign of a plot that was about to unfold. She walked toward Graham, her stiletto heels marking a steady rhythm on the wooden floor. Each step was calculated, every movement seemed rehearsed to project power and control. The tight red dress Sabrina wore captured the last rays of the day, making her appear like a living flame in that dim environment. Her shiny black hair fell in perfect waves, and her eyes, two pools of unfathomable darkness, were fixed on Graham. She moved like a predator about to attack, her long, well-groomed fingers sliding across the desk surface. "Did you bring everything?" she asked, her voice low but laced with authority. Graham smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes and took an envelope from his Italian leather briefcase. "The life insurance papers are here," he replied, placing the envelope on the table with exaggerated care. His voice was controlled, but there was an undertone of barely disguised satisfaction. "Now we just need to make sure he signs the last document and, of course, that your dear mother-in-law doesn't interfere." Sabrina's expression instantly hardened. She leaned over the desk, moving closer to Graham with eyes that seemed to want to pierce him. "That old woman is suspecting something," she hissed with a contained fury that seemed about to explode at any moment. "And Nora, that meddlesome maid, is watching me too closely." Today, at the hospital, Sabrina broke off, her gaze abruptly shifting to the half-open door. For a moment, the silence in the office was absolute. Even Graham's breathing seemed to cease. Then, a soft sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, breaking the tension. Sabrina quickly straightened up, recomposing herself like an actress returning to the stage. The door opened further, revealing Evangeline's small, impeccable figure. Her eyes, as black as her mother's, shone with curiosity, but there was something more, something Beatrick feared to recognize. "Uncle Graham," Evangeline began, her childlike voice laden with sweetness. "Are you really going to give Dad a special gift?" Her question sounded innocent, but the smile that accompanied the words betrayed a sinister understanding. The girl knew more than she should, and Graham and Sabrina instantly understood this. Graham, regaining his composure, smiled back at the girl. "Yes, dear," he replied in an affectionate tone. "A gift Dad will never forget." Sabrina watched the interaction with a mixture of pride and caution, her arms crossed over her chest like a lioness protecting her territory. Sabrina then approached her daughter, bending down slightly until she was at the girl's level. "Evangeline, my love," she began, her sweet voice masking the ice in her tone. "Why don't you go see if Grandma has taken her medicine? You know how forgetful she's been lately." Her suggestion was imbued with an underlying cruelty, and Evangeline smiled in response, as if she perfectly understood the insinuation. Before the girl could answer, a sound in the hallway captured the attention of the three. Nora passed silently, the fabric of her gray uniform almost merging with the late afternoon shadows. For a brief moment, Nora's and Sabrina's gazes met. In the governess's eyes, there was horror and fear; in Sabrina's, only coldness and contempt. Graham, perceiving the gravity of the situation, began to hastily put away the papers, his previously calculated movements now becoming tenser. "We need to be more careful," he muttered, adjusting his silk tie while glancing toward the door. "And Ambrose cannot suspect anything until we are ready." Sabrina, however, seemed unshaken. She smiled slightly, but the smile did not reach her eyes. "Don't worry about Nora," she said, her voice low but laden with determination. "I already have plans for her and that wretched family of hers. Soon, she will no longer be a problem." Her tone was so cold that even Graham, accustomed to her lack of scruples, seemed to shudder. Evangeline was still standing at the door, watching the scene with morbid curiosity. "Mommy," the girl called, her sweet voice contrasting with the content of her words. "Can I help make Nora go away, just like we're going to help Daddy rest forever?" Pride shone in Sabrina's eyes as she looked at her daughter. "Of course, my angel," she replied, caressing the girl's face with delicate fingers. "You're learning so fast." At that moment, the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, plunging the office into deep shadows. Graham, trying to recompose himself, turned on the desk lamp. The yellowish light illuminated only a small circle around them, while the rest of the office remained dark, as if the scene were being staged under spotlights.
The shadows projected on the walls took on grotesque shapes, reinforcing the atmosphere of conspiracy. "The life insurance is at the maximum value," Graham whispered, as if fearing someone might overhear through the walls.
"And with the modifications we made to the will." He did not finish the sentence, for Sabrina raised her hand, asking for silence. Her senses seemed sharpened, catching something beyond Graham's reach.
Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ambrose was returning from the video conference, rapidly approaching.
Sabrina, with the deftness of one who lives by appearances, rearranged the scene in seconds. She turned to Evangeline with a sweet smile.
"Dear, go play in the garden. Uncle Graham and I need to finish the preparations for Daddy's surprise party, remember?"
Evangeline nodded but cast a last curious glance at the documents on the table before leaving. As Ambrose approached, Nora remained hidden in the shadows of the hallway, her heart racing and her hands trembling as she held the cell phone with which she had recorded the conversation. She knew that recording was the only proof of what she had just witnessed. However, what Nora did not know was that Sabrina had already noticed the reflection of the phone's screen glare on the glass door of the office. "You know, my dear," Sabrina began, her melodious voice dripping with venom, "I've been researching some wonderful nursing homes, especially those far away from here in the poorer neighborhoods of the city.
Places where no one asks questions when elderly troublemakers show up with a few bruises.
Where the screams at night are so common that no one cares anymore. Where visits are discouraged. And most interestingly, many of these places have special wings for patients who develop sudden mental issues." She leaned in closer to Beatrice, her eyes glinting with malice.
"Can you imagine? One day to the next, a perfectly lucid lady starts having terrible hallucinations, mental confusion. It's amazing how some medications can cause that kind of effect, isn't it?
And poor Ambrose will be so busy taking care of the business that he'll hardly have time for visits. After all, who would want to see a mother who doesn't even recognize her own son anymore?" Her words were accompanied by the drumming of her long, manicured fingers over the medicine bottles. The sound, repetitive and cold, filled the silence of the room like a threatening drip. Beatrice felt panic growing inside her. She tried to respond, but her voice came out weaker than she would have liked. "My son would never allow," she said, more like a prayer than a statement. Her eyes searched for something, anything, that could bring her comfort at that moment.
But the smile Sabrina played in response dispelled any hope. "Your son?"
Sabrina laughed, a low and cruel sound that made Beatrice shudder. She approached her mother-in-law like a snake about to strike, her heels marking each step with threatening precision. "Your precious Ambrose does absolutely everything I want, dear mother-in-law. Every decision, every thought, everything goes through my scrutiny." She began circling the armchair where Beatrice was seated, her fingers gliding over the velvet backrest.
"Or haven't you realized how he didn't even question your little incident in the kitchen? How he so easily accepted that you slipped, that you're confused?"
Each word was uttered with sadistic pleasure. Leaning in until her face was inches from Beatrice's, her expensive perfume suffocating the air between them, Sabrina continued.
"Do you know why?
Because I built the perfect wife, the devoted mother he always dreamed of, the concerned daughter-in-law everyone admires. Every smile, every public gesture of affection, meticulously planned." She gripped Beatrice's chin forcefully, forcing her mother-in-law to look at her.
"Who do you think he'll believe? The beloved wife who never left his side, who gave him the perfect family? Or the senile old woman who can barely remember where she left her glasses?"
Her smile widened as she saw the fear in her mother-in-law's eyes.
"Speaking of memory," Sabrina added, her tone almost casual. "Those sleeping pills of yours. Sometimes I wonder if they're not too strong.
It would be a shame if you started having more serious episodes of confusion." The sound of childish footsteps in the hallway interrupted the cruel monologue. Beatrice froze upon hearing the soft shuffle of slippers on the floor. Evangeline appeared at the door, wearing a delicate embroidered silk pajama, the picture of childish innocence. But the glint in the girl's eyes revealed something darker. "Look, Evangeline, how helpful," Sabrina said, turning to her daughter with a smile that mixed pride and something more perverse. "Come here, dear.
Help Mommy take care of Grandma.
Evangeline entered the room carrying a glass of water, holding it with her small hands. Her eyes shone with malice, a disturbing reflection of her mother's influence.
Grandma, drink it all up, she sang with unsettling sweetness. Mommy said old people need lots of water, especially before bedtime. Isn't that right, Mommy?
Beatrice's hands were shaking so much that she could barely hold the glass when the girl offered it to her. Sabrina, with her arms crossed and a satisfied look, seemed to be watching the performance of her masterpiece. The combination of terror in Beatrice's eyes and Evangeline's somber obedience was what she appeared to aim for.
Do you know what else I learned about nursing homes, dear?
Sabrina continued, pacing around the room and casually adjusting the pillows on the bed. Some have special wings for patients with mental issues. Those who start having hallucinations, imagining things, accusing innocent people of mistreatment. She shot a sharp look at Beatrice, who felt her stomach churn.
Evangeline watched the scene with morbid curiosity.
Mommy, the girl asked, looking at her mother as if seeking approval, is it true that when old people get really confused, they need stronger medication? Yes, darling, Sabrina replied, caressing her daughter's hair with delicate fingers. Sometimes, when the old folks don't want to cooperate, we need to help them understand that it's for their own good.
Isn't that right, mother-in-law?
She looked directly at Beatrice, her cold eyes meeting her mother-in-law's in the reflection of the vanity mirror.
The trembling in Beatrice's hands became uncontrollable. The glass slipped from her fingers, shattering into hundreds of pieces against the marble floor.
The water spilled around the armchair, reflecting the light from the lamp like tiny tears. Sabrina remained motionless, merely observing as a slow, cruel smile curved her lips. So clumsy, Grandma, Evangeline commented, her childish voice carrying a venomous tone.
I think Mommy is right.
You really do need special care. The statement was uttered with a disturbing naturalness, as if it were an absolute truth. Sabrina took a step forward, her heels crushing the shards of glass in her path. The sound echoed through the room, a frightening reminder of the control she exerted. Bending down, she picked up a fresh glass from the silver tray and filled it with water. Don't worry, my sweet old lady, she said, her voice now low but still laden with threat.
We have all night ahead of us to make sure you take your remedies.
The light from the lamps cast distorted shadows on the walls, amplifying the sensation of suffocation. Beatrice knew that at that moment, she was completely at the mercy of her daughter-in-law's refined cruelty and her granddaughter's ruthless gaze, who should have once brought joy to her life. The morning in the city awoke with a gentle breeze that swayed the bougainvillea leaves in the garden of the Lockwood mansion. The sky displayed shades of pink and gold, a spectacle of beauty that seemed to mock the darkness of the previous night's events. The mansion, with its light stone facade and wrought iron details, remained imposing, but within its walls, the atmosphere was tense. In the vast garden, Nora walked carefully, balancing a silver tray with breakfast. Her steps were hesitant on the pebbled path that wound between the flower beds, as if each step carried the weight of what she knew. In the distance, a sound made her stop. It was a muffled sob, almost imperceptible, but Nora knew that sound. It wasn't the first time she had heard Beatrice's crying during the nights. The sobs escaped from the matriarch's room, echoing like the laments of a lost soul. Now, the sound came from the gazebo at the back of the garden, where the flowering vines created a shady refuge. Nora's heart tightened as she recognized the pain in those sobs. She knew that Beatrice was no longer the strong, self-assured woman she had known, but a frightened shadow of who she once was. She approached the gazebo with soft steps, her hands gripping the tray as if it were a shield against the forces she feared. There, on one of the white-painted wooden benches, Beatrice was curled up, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. The blue silk robe she wore, once a symbol of elegance, now seemed too large for her thin, hunched body. Her hands trembled as she held an embroidered handkerchief, vainly trying to dry the tears that streamed down her wrinkled face. The morning's brilliance reflected in the droplets, transforming them into tiny prisms that contrasted with the expression of pure despair. Mrs. Beatrice, Nora called, her voice low, almost fearing to break the silence of the moment.
You haven't eaten anything today.
She approached slowly, her movements measured, like someone approaching an injured bird. The tray carried fresh coffee, soft bread, and perfectly arranged fruit, a meal that should bring comfort. but now seemed only a reminder of emptiness. Beatrice raised her gaze, and what Nora saw in her eyes made her stomach churn. There was terror, deep and paralyzing. The matriarch gripped the governess's arm with surprising strength for someone so frail. Beatrice began, but her voice failed before she could complete her sentence. She took a deep breath, trying to gather strength. She said she's going to send me to a nursing home. Her words came out in an urgent whisper, almost begging for help. She said she'll convince Ambrose that I'm crazy. Nora, she described horrible places where no one would hear me scream. Nora felt her heart tighten even more. She set the tray down on the small gazebo table and sat down beside Beatrice, momentarily breaking the barriers that had always separated mistress and servant. Mrs. Beatrice, this cannot continue like this, she said, her voice charged with emotion. We need to tell Mr. Ambrose. He has to know what's happening before it's too late. Before she could continue, a childish voice cut through the air like a blade. Grandma's talking to herself again, Evangeline called, her voice laden with false innocence. The girl stood at the entrance to the gazebo, her school uniform neat and a malicious smile mirroring her mother's. Nora stood up immediately, regaining her servile posture, but the damage was already done. Sabrina emerged right behind her daughter, her imposing figure standing out against the soft morning light. She wore an emerald green silk ensemble that seemed to glimmer with each movement, as if it were the skin of a snake about to attack. Her face was impeccably made up, but it was in her eyes that the true venom concentrated. Darling, what a fright, she said, approaching with firm steps while her voice took on a tone of false concern. Walking around the garden like that, all alone, after all your recent episodes. Beatrice tried to stand up, but her legs faltered. Instinctively, Nora extended her hand to help, but Sabrina's sharp gaze made her stop. You should rest, sweetie, Sabrina continued, leaning slightly over her mother-in-law. Ambrose and I were just talking about getting you some professional help, places where they could take good care of you. The sound of male footsteps on the stone path drew everyone's attention. Ambrose approached, his erect posture and impeccable navy blue suit standing out against the garden's backdrop. His expression was a mix of confusion and concern. The sun reflected off his glasses, making it difficult to read his eyes, but there was something in the tension of his shoulders that suggested doubt. Daddy! Evangeline shouted, running toward him. Her voice seemed laden with childlike sweetness, but Nora knew it was a rehearsed performance. Grandma was talking to herself again, and Nora was here with her, just like that time Mommy said they were plotting something. Sabrina walked over to Ambrose with her usual elegance, immediately assuming the role of devoted wife. Darling, she began, her voice mellifluous, I think we need to talk about your mother. She cast a quick glance at Beatrice, as if reinforcing her concern. It's been a while since I've noticed worrying behaviors. Nora remained motionless, feeling powerless as the web of lies was woven before her. In her hand, the handkerchief Beatrice had dropped felt like an unbearable weight. In the pocket of her apron, the cell phone with the recording of the conversation between Sabrina and Graham burned like a secret that could save or destroy lives. Ambrose slowly approached the gazebo, his eyes fixed on his mother. There was something different in her expression now, a spark of doubt that hadn't been there before. Sabrina noticed it too. For a brief moment, her smile wavered, but she quickly regained it. Ambrose, she said, trying to catch his attention, but her voice didn't sound as confident as before. The shrill ringing of Ambrose's phone interrupted the moment. He looked at the screen inside. It's Graham, he said, already answering the call. It must be about the business we discussed yesterday. He walked away, his voice fading into a murmur in the background. The silence that followed was almost palpable. Sabrina remained still, watching Ambrose walk away. When he finally disappeared from sight, her smile changed. It was no longer the mask of concern she wore in front of her husband, but a cold and calculated expression. She turned to Beatrice and Nora, her gaze laden with malice. The game wasn't over yet, but at that moment, Nora knew the pieces were about to shift. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the Lockwood Mansion's living room, creating soft, colorful patterns that danced across the antique furniture. The intricately carved wooden chairs with upholstery in shades of gold reflected the light, a reminder of the opulence this house exuded. Yet, the beauty of the surroundings was merely a facade for the tension that filled the air. On the deep red velvet sofa, Sabrina and Graham sat too close, like conspiratorial accomplices. Their relaxed postures and occasional laughter hid the rot of their plans. Graham's dark gray suit was impeccable, contrasting with Sabrina's emerald green dress, which shimmered slightly under the filtered light from the stained glass. The sweet scent of Sabrina's expensive perfume mingled with the woody smell of the cognac Graham held in a crystal glass. The white marble coffee table, with gold accents, supported carefully arranged documents beside an unlit cigar. The room, usually a space for family gatherings, was now the stage for sordid secrets. The classic wall clock marked 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a time Sabrina knew to be safe. Ambrose was still at his office, immersed in the business he entrusted so blindly to his best friend. The plan is perfect, Sabrina thought, her fingers smoothing an imaginary crease in the fabric of her dress. The plan is perfect, Graham murmured, leaning back on the sofa. His eyes glinted with an almost feral ambition. The life insurance has been increased to $5 million. No one will suspect a heart attack in a stressed man. He swirled the cognac in his glass, watching the amber liquid as if foreseeing his victory. His fingers brushed against Sabrina's as he set the glass on the table, and he smiled, testing the limits of their complicity. Sabrina leaned in closer, her elegant posture contrasting with the intensity of her words. The fabric of her dress slid against the velvet of the sofa, creating a soft sound that almost disappeared beneath the weight of their dialogue. Before that, we need to eliminate the obstacles, she said, her voice low but laden with determination. Her dark eyes locked with Graham's. Nora, that nosy old woman, is starting to sniff around too much, Sabrina continued, leaning even closer to Graham, her voice a venomous whisper. That meddlesome maid has heard things she shouldn't have. You know what's most interesting? Her eldest son works security in that dangerous neighborhood. It would be a tragedy if he had an accident at work, wouldn't it? And the younger one, the pregnant one. Imagine the despair of a young single mother with nowhere to live with her baby. Her voice turned icy. As for our dear mother-in-law, I was researching some public nursing homes in the more problematic areas of the city. The ones where patients tend to disappear mysteriously and no one asks questions. We need to eliminate these inconveniences before they open their mouths. And you know I always get what I want, don't you, dear? The silence that followed was heavy with malice. Graham kept his smile, but there was a shadow of hesitation in his eyes. He poured himself more cognac before responding. And what about the admission, he asked, his casual tone contrasting with the content of his words. Is the doctor already prepared to certify the old woman's dementia? He leaned in slightly, as if his interest were purely practical, but the smile on his lips betrayed the pleasure he took in this scheme. Sabrina raised her eyebrows, clearly pleased with her own foresight. All arranged, she replied, a satisfied smile curving her red lips. Dr. Garcia is very receptive when the value is adequate. After Ambrose dies, it will be easy to convince everyone that his poor mother went mad with grief, a classic case of emotional collapse. She laughed softly, the crystalline sound like cracked glass about to shatter. The sound of tiny footsteps momentarily interrupted the conversation. Evangeline played nearby at the piano, her small hands clumsily sliding across the keys. The fragmented melody that came from the instrument seemed an unsettling echo of the disorder that inhabited this house. Wearing a frilly lilac dress, the little girl looked like a porcelain doll, perfect on the outside but hollow within. And what about the girl? Graham asked, turning his head to watch Evangeline. His voice carried an almost paternal tone, but there was something else there, a concern he tried to mask with a casual expression. Isn't she too young to understand all this? His eyes met Sabrina's, hoping for an answer that might ease his conscience. Sabrina cast a glance at her daughter, her smile widening into a perverse pride. My little one is learning well, she replied, beckoning Evangeline with an elegant gesture. Isn't that right, darling? Tell Uncle Graham what Mommy taught you about useless old people. The sweetness in her voice contrasted with the venom it carried. Evangeline approached with graceful steps, her dark curls swaying gently. Her large, dark eyes fixed on Graham before answering, her childlike voice clear and calm.
Mom said old people are a nuisance, Uncle. They just get in the way and need to be removed.
A smile appeared on her lips, small but laden with malice. It was a perfect replica of Sabrina's smile, precisely molded by years of influence. At that moment, a subtle movement caught Evangeline's attention. Through the reflection in the Venetian mirror in the room, she saw something. Ambrose was standing in the entrance, partially hidden by the French silk curtain. His figure was motionless, but his presence was unmistakable. The face that usually displayed serenity was now marked by shock, his wide eyes fixed on the trio before him.
And you know what else, Uncle?
Evangeline continued, unaware that her father was listening to every word. Mom said that after Daddy goes to heaven, we'll be very rich, and Grandma will go to a special place where no one will believe her stories. The girl's voice sounded melodious, almost too sweet for the gravity of what she was saying. The sound of breaking glass cut through the air. Ambrose, without realizing it, had dropped his phone to the floor. Sabrina and Graham startled, turning to look for the source of the noise, but Ambrose, moved by quick reflexes, silently retreated down the hallway before they could see him. His heart pounded erratically, and his mind struggled to process what he had just heard. The reality he knew was crumbling. Sabrina rose from the couch with fluid movements, smoothing her dress as if nothing had happened. "Speaking of your father," she said in a casual tone, "we need to finalize the preparations for tomorrow's special dinner.
It will be an unforgettable night."
Her voice carried a veiled promise that she knew only Graham would understand. In the hallway, Ambrose leaned against the wall, his breath heavy and uneven. The last few minutes had revealed a truth he had never imagined possible. 20 years of marriage, a decades-long friendship with Graham, it was all a lie. His daughter's words echoed in his mind like a death knell. Mom said that after Daddy goes to heaven. The sound of Evangeline's laughter pierced the walls, mingling with the clinking of Graham's crystal glass and Sabrina's soft, conspiratorial chuckles. It was a macabre symphony that finally opened Ambrose's eyes to the truth that had been in front of him all along. Night had settled over the Lockwood mansion like a heavy cloak of secrets. Outside, the treetops swayed gently in the breeze, casting undulating shadows across the tall windows. Inside the study, Ambrose worked under the warm glow of an antique lamp, creating a pool of dim illumination amidst the shadowy surroundings. The dark wooden bookshelves, crammed with volumes, and the sturdy mahogany furnishings lent the space an air of solidity and tradition. But tonight, everything felt more oppressive. The silence was broken only by the faint ticking of the wall clock, each beat seeming to synchronize with Ambrose's racing thoughts. Seated at his desk, Ambrose's face, usually serene, was etched with tension. His green eyes seemed lost, fixed on some indeterminate point on the desktop as he tried to piece together the puzzle forming in his mind. The words he had overheard earlier, coming from his own daughter, echoed incessantly, "After Daddy goes to heaven." It was a childlike yet cruel phrase, delivered with unsettling sweetness, but containing the bitter truth of a conspiracy he was just beginning to comprehend. His hands trembled slightly as he rifled through drawers and files. He needed proof, something to confirm what his heart already knew to be true. Each document he examined seemed to pulse with added weight, as if the paper carried not just information but the fate of his family. The clock struck 11 when Ambrose found the first evidence, a life insurance policy in his name. The numbers leapt out at him immediately. The value was astronomically higher than what he remembered purchasing. What truly made his stomach churn was the date of the alteration, coinciding with the start of Sabrina's and Graham's frequent business meetings. Ambrose rubbed his face with both hands, trying to shake off the crushing weight of the discovery. The final detail was like a punch to the gut. One of the signatures on the document was an almost perfect imitation of his own. He recognized the handwriting only because he knew the intricacies of his own signature strokes. With trembling fingers, he continued his search, a sense of urgency growing with each passing second. He opened a hidden compartment at the back of the desk, revealing something even more disturbing: bank statements showing suspicious transfers to accounts he didn't recognize, all made by Graham in recent months. Beside them, a folder contained supposed medical evaluations of his health, documents detailing a progressive deterioration he had never experienced. The sound of footsteps in the hallway interrupted his investigation, making his heart race. Ambrose froze, his breath caught. For one terrifying moment, he thought it might be Sabrina, but soon realized the cadence was different, hesitant, cautious. The door slowly opened, revealing Nora, still dressed in her gray housekeeper uniform. Her face was etched with worry, the lines of expression deeper than usual. "Don Ambrose," she called, her voice almost a whisper.
"There is something you need to know."
Ambrose gestured for her to enter and quickly closed the door behind her, locking it with a click that sounded loud in the silence of the office. He could see the fear in Nora's eyes, the same fear he felt. Her wrinkled hands twisted on her apron as if seeking something to anchor her. "Nora, please," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion.
"Tell me everything, no matter how terrible it is." The loyalty built over decades between employer and employee created a moment of absolute honesty. Nora took a deep breath, taking a cell phone out of her pocket with trembling hands.
"I have a recording, Don Ambrose," she began, her voice faltering slightly.
"Donna Sabrina and Don Graham. They were in the office earlier today."
Her eyes shifted to the door as if fearing someone might overhear her. Before she could continue, an almost imperceptible sound in the hallway made them both freeze.
Ambrose gave a slight nod, encouraging her to go on.
Nora tapped the screen of the cell phone, and the audio began to play.
Sabrina's voice echoed in the small space, so familiar and yet strangely cold. "The poison can't be detected. It will seem like a heart attack."
Ambrose felt his whole body stiffen as he heard Graham calmly respond, discussing the details of the plan as if talking about a dinner menu. The conversation continued, filled with occasional laughter and a tone of confidence that only intensified the horror of the situation. As they listened, neither of them noticed the small shadow moving outside. Evangeline, still in her silk pajamas, peered through the crack in the door, her dark eyes shining with the malice that seemed to have been born in her. Silently, the girl quickly retreated, running through the corridors with a smile that didn't match her age. "They plan to do it tomorrow night," Nora continued, turning off the audio and stuffing the cell phone back into her pocket. Her voice now visibly trembled.
"During the special dinner that Donna Sabrina is organizing, Don Ambrose. They also have plans for your mother.
They want to commit her to a horrible place where no one will hear her." Tears began to stream down the wrinkled face of the housekeeper, her hands shaking so much that Ambrose had to hold them to calm her down. Ambrose felt as if the ground was disappearing from under his feet. He sank into the leather chair, his hands buried in his hair. 20 years of marriage, decades of friendship with Graham, it was all an illusion, a macabre play that would culminate in his own death. "My mother's medicine," he muttered, a new thought hitting him with force.
"Sabrina has insisted on giving it to her personally. She always says Nora is too busy to take care of it."
He looked up, filled with terror.
"What has she been giving my mother?"
Before Nora could answer, another noise came from the hallway, louder this time.
They both startled, and Ambrose quickly put the incriminating documents away in the drawer.
His brain was working overtime, formulating a plan as time seemed to run out rapidly. Ambrose straightened himself in his chair, trying to maintain composure despite the storm brewing inside him. He signaled for Nora to leave the office quietly.
"Go," he whispered. "We need to act as if nothing is wrong. I'll handle this."
Nora hesitated, her wrinkled hands trembling as she clutched the phone. "Don Ambrose, please be careful," she pleaded, her voice barely audible. Ambrose gave her a reassuring nod, though his heart pounded like a war drum. Nora exited the office, and he locked the door behind her, his mind racing. He had less than 24 hours to stop a plan that would not only end his life but also destroy his mother's.
The following day dawned with an almost surreal calmness.
The Lockwood mansion was bustling with preparations for the special dinner. Sabrina had summoned the staff early, and the air buzzed with activity. Crystal chandeliers sparkled, and the long dining table was adorned with fresh white lilies and gold-rimmed plates. To any outsider, it would appear to be a celebration of wealth and unity. Beatrice, however, sensed the sinister undertone behind the facade. Sitting in her room, she watched from her window as workers arranged the garden with fairy lights and luxurious outdoor seating. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her shawl, her thoughts clouded by anxiety. The image of Sabrina's cold smile haunted her like a specter.
Nora entered the room quietly, carrying a tray of tea.
Her presence was a rare source of comfort for Beatrice. Setting the tray on the side table, Nora leaned in close. "Don Ambrose knows everything," she whispered, her voice urgent but careful.
"He's preparing something, Senora. But we must stay vigilant."
Beatrice nodded slowly, her eyes filling with a glimmer of hope. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of belief that her son might protect her.
As evening fell, the mansion was transformed into a dazzling spectacle.
Guests began arriving in expensive cars, stepping out in elegant attire that shimmered under the glow of the garden lights. The sound of clinking glasses and polite laughter filled the air. Sabrina moved through the crowd like a queen, her emerald gown hugging her figure and her every step calculated to exude grace and control.
Graham was already mingling, a glass of wine in hand as he charmed the guests with anecdotes.
His gray hair and tailored suit gave him an air of sophistication, but his eyes held the unmistakable gleam of someone savoring an anticipated victory.
Ambrose, in contrast, was uncharacteristically subdued.
He greeted guests with a forced smile, his mind entirely focused on the night's unfolding events. Hidden under his tailored suit jacket was a small recording device, a precaution he hoped would be unnecessary but couldn't afford to forego.
Dinner was served with pomp and elegance.
The table was filled with exquisite dishes: lobster bisque, truffle-infused risotto, and roasted lamb. Crystal glasses sparkled as wine was poured generously, and soft classical music played in the background.
Sabrina sat at the head of the table, radiating confidence.
She raised her glass for a toast, her voice carrying a warmth that belied her true intentions. "To family and friends," she began, her eyes briefly meeting Graham's across the table.
"And to a night we'll all remember."
Her words hung in the air, carrying a double meaning that only a few in the room could decipher. Beatrice sat silently, her appetite gone as she toyed with the edge of her napkin. Nora, positioned discreetly near the kitchen doors, watched every move Sabrina made, her heart pounding in fear. Ambrose, seated beside Sabrina, forced a smile as he clinked glasses with her. He studied her every move, waiting for the moment he knew would come. His hand rested on his pocket, where the recording device remained ready. As dessert was served, an elaborate chocolate soufflé with gold leaf decoration, Sabrina leaned toward Ambrose, her hand brushing against his. "Darling, would you mind getting the special wine from the cellar?" she asked sweetly, her voice carrying an undertone that only he could recognize.
Ambrose's jaw tightened.
He nodded and rose from the table, walking toward the cellar with deliberate steps. As soon as he was out of sight, Sabrina signaled to Graham with a barely perceptible nod. Graham, ever the actor, excused himself from the table and followed Ambrose. In the dimly lit cellar, surrounded by shelves of aged wine bottles, Ambrose stood waiting. He wasn't looking for the wine, he was waiting for Graham, and he didn't have to wait long. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the stone steps, and Graham appeared, his silhouette sharp against the faint light. "Ambrose," Graham greeted, his tone casual but his eyes cold.
"Sabrina thought you might need help choosing the right vintage."
Ambrose turned slowly, meeting Graham's gaze. For a moment, neither man spoke, the tension thick as the cellar's musty air. "Graham," Ambrose began, his voice low but steady, "how long have you been planning to kill me?"
The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Graham's expression flickered, the mask of affability slipping for just a moment before he recovered.
"I don't know what you're talking about," Graham replied, his voice measured.
"You must be under a lot of stress. Sabrina's been worried about you."
Ambrose took a step closer, his green eyes piercing. "Save it," he said, his voice hardening. "I know everything about the insurance, the will, the poison."
"I heard it all."
Graham's composure faltered, and his hand twitched as if reaching for something in his pocket. "You're making a mistake," Graham said, his voice now tinged with warning.
"This isn't how it looks."
Ambrose stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper.
"It's exactly how it looks. And you're going to pay for it." Graham's facade of composure finally cracked.
His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed as he realized there was no point in continuing the charade. The dim light of the cellar flickered slightly, casting sharp shadows on his face, making his sinister intentions even more apparent. "You always were too trusting, Ambrose," Graham said, his tone shifting from feigned innocence to a chilling coldness.
You never saw the bigger picture, did you?
Always busy running around, building your empire, while Sabrina and I made plans that mattered. Ambrose's fists clenched at his sides, but he held his ground, his eyes locked onto the man he had once called a friend.
And what is the bigger picture, Graham?
Ambrose asked, his voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath it.
Murder? Betrayal? Stealing everything I've built?
Graham took a slow step forward, his polished shoes clicking against the stone floor.
Survival, he said simply. You're a means to an end, Ambrose. You and your mother are obstacles in the way of something greater. Sabrina and I.
Enough, Ambrose interrupted, his voice rising.
You won't get away with this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small recording device, holding it up for Graham to see. I have proof. You and Sabrina are finished. For a brief moment, Graham's eyes widened, the realization of what Ambrose had done sinking in.
But then, his expression darkened, and he lunged forward.
Ambrose anticipated the move. He sidestepped quickly, dodging Graham's grasp.
The recording device fell to the ground in the scuffle, skidding across the stone floor. Graham turned toward it, but Ambrose was faster, kicking it out of reach. You won't destroy the evidence, Ambrose said, his voice filled with resolve.
Not this time. Upstairs in the dining room, the atmosphere was jovial, though Sabrina's gaze constantly drifted toward the doorway.
She stirred her glass of wine absent-mindedly, her polished nails tapping against the crystal. Everything all right, darling? One of the guests asked, noticing her distraction. Sabrina forced a radiant smile, one that could have convinced anyone unaware of her true nature. Perfect, she replied, raising her glass slightly. Just waiting for Ambrose to return with the wine. He always takes such care with these things. She glanced at Evangeline, who was seated nearby, nibbling on a dessert. The child returned her mother's smile with a knowing look that sent a chill through Beatrice, who sat silently at the other end of the table. Nora, positioned near the kitchen door, observed everything with a watchful eye. Her heart raced with unease, knowing Ambrose was confronting Graham in the cellar. Back in the cellar, the confrontation escalated. Graham, now desperate, grabbed a nearby bottle of wine and smashed it against the edge of a shelf, creating a makeshift weapon. The jagged glass glinted dangerously in the faint light. Step aside, Ambrose, Graham growled, his voice low and menacing. Give me the recorder, and maybe I'll let you walk out of here. Ambrose stood his ground, his eyes unwavering. You've already taken my trust, my family's safety, and years of my life, he said, his voice firm. I won't let you take anything more. Graham lunged forward, the broken bottle aimed at Ambrose. The two men struggled, the sound of their scuffle echoing through the cellar. Bottles clattered and shattered as they collided with the shelves. With a sudden burst of strength, Ambrose disarmed Graham, sending the jagged bottle flying across the room. He grabbed Graham by the collar, slamming him against the wall. This ends now, Ambrose said, his voice like steel. The door to the cellar burst open at that moment, and Sabrina appeared, her face a mask of calculated rage. What's going on here? She demanded, her voice sharp as a blade. Ambrose released Graham, who slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. What's going on, Sabrina? Ambrose said, turning to face her, is that I know everything. The lies, the betrayal, the plan to kill me. It's over. Sabrina's eyes flicked to the recording device lying on the floor. Her expression darkened, but she quickly composed herself. Ambrose, darling, she said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. You've been under so much stress lately. Maybe you're not thinking clearly. Let's go back upstairs and talk about this calmly. Ambrose shook his head, his gaze piercing. Don't play innocent with me, Sabrina, he said. Your lies won't work anymore. He picked up the recording device and held it up. This is all the proof I need, he said. Your voices, your plans, it's all here. Sabrina's composure finally cracked. Her eyes burned with fury, and her lips curled into a sneer. You always were weak, Ambrose, she spat. That's why you'll never win. You think you can stop me? You don't have what it takes. Ambrose squared his shoulders, his expression unyielding.
He could feel the weight of years of deception crashing down, but instead of breaking him, it ignited a fire within. "You underestimate me, Sabrina," he said, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "That's your mistake." Sabrina's sneer deepened, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the cellar. Nora appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. Behind her was Beatrice, clutching the arm of one of the mansion's security guards, a younger man who had long admired the elderly matriarch's kindness. "What's going on here?" Beatrice's voice, though trembling, carried an authority that made everyone in the room turn toward her. Ambrose took a step back from Graham, who had slumped against the wall, glaring at the intrusion. Sabrina, ever quick to adapt, immediately shifted her expression to one of feigned concern. "Mother," she began, her tone overly sweet, "Ambrose has been acting erratically. He's accusing me and Graham of things that are simply untrue. I think the stress has." "Enough!" Beatrice's voice rang out, silencing Sabrina mid-sentence. The room fell into an uneasy quiet as the matriarch took a step forward, her frail figure seeming to grow stronger with each word. "I've spent months watching you chip away at my son's trust, filling this house with your poison," Beatrice said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "But no more. It ends here." Sabrina's mask of sweetness dissolved into anger. Her lips tightened, and her eyes flashed with fury. "You don't know what you're talking about, old woman," she hissed, taking a step toward Beatrice. But Nora stepped between them, her small frame blocking Sabrina's path. "Don't you dare speak to her like that," Nora said, her voice low but fierce. "We all know what you've been doing. I have the proof." She pulled out her phone and played the recording of Sabrina and Graham's incriminating conversation. The room filled with the cold, calculating words of their conspiracy, every detail laid bare for all to hear. Graham's face drained of color, and he pushed himself off the wall, his voice shaking as he tried to deflect. This is taken out of context," he stammered. "It's nothing but a misunderstanding." Sabrina, however, didn't bother to deny it. Her gaze shifted from Nora to Ambrose, and she smirked, as if daring him to act. "You think this changes anything?" she asked, her tone icy. "Ambrose, you don't have the stomach to do what's necessary. That's why I've always been one step ahead of you." Ambrose met her gaze, his expression hardening. "You're wrong," he said simply. He turned to the security guard and handed him the recording device. "Take this to the police," Ambrose instructed. "And make sure it gets into the right hands." The guard nodded, his face grim, and left the cellar without hesitation. Sabrina's confidence wavered for the first time. She turned to Graham, her voice rising in desperation. "Do something," she snapped. But Graham only shook his head, the fight draining from him as he realized the noose was tightening. "You dragged me into this," he muttered, stepping away from her. "I'm not going down with you." Sabrina's fury erupted. "You coward," she screamed. "You think you can just walk away from this? You're as guilty as I am." "Enough!" Ambrose's voice cut through the chaos, commanding the room's attention. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Sabrina. "You won't manipulate anyone anymore," he said. "It's over." Sabrina's shoulders sagged as the weight of her downfall finally settled upon her. For a moment, she seemed smaller, diminished. But then her eyes darted toward the door, and Ambrose saw the spark of defiance flare once more. She bolted toward the exit, her heels clicking against the stone floor. But Nora, with surprising speed, stepped into her path, blocking her escape. "You're not going anywhere," Nora said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the night air, growing louder as they approached the mansion. Beatrice, now seated in the living room with Nora by her side, closed her eyes and exhaled deeply. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace beginning to return. Ambrose stood near the doorway, watching as the police escorted Sabrina and Graham out of the mansion in handcuffs. Sabrina's face was a mask of fury, while Graham looked utterly defeated. As the front door closed behind them, Ambrose turned to his mother and knelt beside her chair. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "I should have seen it sooner."
Beatrice placed a trembling hand on his cheek, her eyes filled with both pain and love.
You saw it when it mattered, she said softly. And you saved us.
Nora, standing nearby, smiled through her tears.
Justice has been served, she said, her voice steady. This house can finally be a home again.
Ambrose nodded, vowing to rebuild the trust and love that had been nearly destroyed by Sabrina's treachery. The Lockwood family had been tested, but together, they would rise again. The next few days at the Lockwood mansion were a whirlwind of activity as the dust settled from the storm Sabrina and Graham had unleashed. The once oppressive atmosphere began to lift, but scars remained, both visible and unseen. Ambrose dedicated himself to repairing the damage, not only within the household but also within himself.
Reclaiming the Lockwood legacy.
Ambrose started by reviewing every financial document, business contract, and personal account that Sabrina and Graham had tampered with. It was a grueling process, but he refused to delegate it to anyone else. He needed to see for himself just how deep their betrayal had gone. Each new discovery, a falsified signature here, a suspicious withdrawal there, was like reopening a wound, but it also fueled his determination. By the end of the week, Ambrose had reclaimed control of his company and ensured that all remaining traces of Graham's influence were removed. He publicly announced Graham's dismissal and the subsequent criminal charges. Investors were initially shaken, but Ambrose's transparency and willingness to address the issues head-on restored their confidence. The life insurance policy Sabrina had tampered with was cancelled, and Ambrose updated his will to ensure his mother's future care and financial security. For the first time in years, he felt like he was taking back the reins of his own life.
Healing the family. Beatrice, though relieved that Sabrina was no longer a threat, struggled to fully recover from the emotional toll of the ordeal.
She spent most of her days in the sunlit corner of the garden, where Nora often joined her. The housekeeper became more than an employee during this time, she was a confidant and a source of strength for the matriarch. Donna Beatrice, Nora said one afternoon as they sipped tea under the shade of the gazebo, "You've been through so much, but you've come out stronger.
Your family needs you more than ever."
Beatrice smiled faintly, her wrinkled hands clasping the porcelain teacup.
"Thank you, Nora," she said softly.
"I don't think I would have survived without you."
Nora shook her head. "We survived because we stood together.
That's what Real Family does."
Evangeline's transformation.
Evangeline, Sabrina's young daughter, posed a more delicate challenge. The child had been heavily influenced by her mother's manipulation, and it would take time to undo the damage. Ambrose worked tirelessly to show his daughter what love and kindness truly look like. He began spending more time with her, reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, and even baking cookies together in the kitchen, a task that left both of them covered in flour but laughing uncontrollably. Slowly but surely, the hardness in Evangeline's demeanor began to soften. One evening, as Ambrose tucked her into bed, Evangeline looked up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Daddy," she said, her voice trembling, "I'm sorry for the things I said, the things Mommy taught me to say." Ambrose's heart ached, and he gently stroked her hair.
"It's not your fault, sweetheart," he said. "What matters is that we're starting fresh. We're a team now, and I'll always be here for you."
Evangeline hugged her father tightly, and for the first time, Ambrose felt like they were truly beginning to heal.
Justice and closure. The trial for Sabrina and Graham was swift, given the overwhelming evidence against them. Nora's recording, combined with the forged documents and financial irregularities, left no room for doubt.
Both were convicted of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder.
Sabrina's final act in court, a venomous glare directed at Ambrose, was met with his calm, unwavering gaze. As the gavel fell, marking the end of the trial, Ambrose felt a sense of finality. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he was ready to face it. A new chapter.
Months later, the Lockwood mansion, once a symbol of control and deceit, became a place of warmth and renewal.
Beatrice, now stronger and more confident, took up painting in the mornings.
Her canvases, filled with vibrant colors, reflected her journey from darkness to light. Nora continued to be a cherished part of the household, not as a servant but as a trusted companion. Her family, who had once lived in fear of Sabrina's threats, now visited the mansion regularly, filling it with laughter and life. Ambrose, with Evangeline by his side, dedicated himself to rebuilding the legacy of the Lockwood family, not just in business but in values.
The father-daughter duo often spent weekends volunteering at local shelters, teaching Evangeline the importance of kindness and humility.
One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Evangeline looked up at her father with a thoughtful expression.
"Daddy," she said, "do you think Grandma is happy now?"
Ambrose smiled, looking over at Beatrice, who was painting under the golden hues of the setting sun.
"Yes, sweetheart," he said. "I think she's finally at peace."
The Lockwoods had weathered a storm that could have destroyed them, but together, they emerged stronger. And as the mansion basked in the warm glow of the evening light, it stood not as a monument to wealth but as a testament to resilience, love, and the unbreakable bonds of family.
A mansion transformed. The Lockwood mansion, once a fortress of isolation, began to transform under Ambrose's leadership and Beatrice's newfound courage.
The heavy, suffocating silence that had once pervaded its halls was replaced by lively chatter, laughter, and the hum of daily life. Rooms that had remained untouched for years were opened, allowing sunlight and fresh air to sweep away the remnants of darkness left by Sabrina's presence. Ambrose initiated a series of changes that reflected his commitment to rebuilding not just the family but the mansion itself as a symbol of hope and inclusivity. He converted the unused West Wing into a community center, inviting local artists, musicians, and writers to share their talents. The once imposing estate, guarded by high iron gates, now welcomed the community with open arms.
Beatrice's Renaissance. For Beatrice, this new chapter was nothing short of a renaissance.
She began hosting small gatherings in the garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and the gentle hum of bees. Her artwork, once a private indulgence, became a centerpiece of these gatherings. Paintings filled with vibrant colors and bold strokes adorned the garden walls, each piece telling a story of resilience and transformation. One morning, while painting a vivid sunset, Beatrice turned to Nora, who was arranging tea on the patio table.
"Do you think it's possible to start over at my age?" Beatrice asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Nora smiled warmly. "You're not starting over, Donna Beatrice.
You're continuing a story that deserves to be told. And every stroke of that brush is proof of it." Beatrice nodded, her confidence bolstered by the words. For the first time in years, she felt like her life belonged to her again.
Ambrose's mission.
Ambrose, driven by the weight of what had nearly been lost, took his mission beyond the confines of the mansion. He launched initiatives aimed at empowering underserved communities, funding educational programs, and providing resources for single parents and elderly care. One of his most ambitious projects was a foundation named after his mother, the Beatrice Aldrich Foundation for Hope. Its primary focus was supporting the elderly who had been neglected or abused, a cause close to his heart after witnessing Sabrina's treatment of Beatrice. During the launch of the foundation, Ambrose gave a heartfelt speech, holding Evangeline's hand as he addressed the crowd. "Family is not just about blood," he said, his voice steady.
"It's about love, respect, and the values we pass down to the next generation.
This foundation is a tribute to my mother's strength and a promise to ensure that no one is left unheard or unprotected." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Beatrice, sitting in the front row, wiped away tears of pride.
Evangeline's journey. For Evangeline, the transition was not without its challenges.
At 8 years old, she carried the weight of her mother's manipulation and the guilt of her own actions. But under Ambrose's gentle guidance, she began to blossom into a kind-hearted and curious child. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Evangeline asked a question that had been weighing on her mind.
"Daddy, do you think I'll ever be like Mommy?" she whispered, her voice trembling.
Ambrose knelt beside her, placing his hands on her small shoulders. "You are your own person, Evangeline," he said firmly. "You have the power to choose kindness, to do good, and to be better. And I'll be here every step of the way to help you." Evangeline hugged him tightly, and from that day on, she became an active participant in her father's community efforts. She often spent weekends helping at shelters or playing with children in the community center, her laughter a testament to the healing power of love and guidance.
Nora's legacy.
Nora, who had played a pivotal role in exposing Sabrina and Graham's treachery, became an honorary member of the Lockwood family. Her loyalty and courage were celebrated, and Ambrose ensured that her family was never in want again. Ambrose gifted Nora a home near the mansion, where she could live with her children and grandchildren. It was a modest yet beautiful house surrounded by fruit trees and a small garden, a space that symbolized peace and gratitude. "Your courage saved us," Ambrose told her during the housewarming celebration.
"This is the least we can do to thank you."
Nora, overwhelmed with emotion, simply nodded.
A symbol of renewal.
As the years passed, the Lockwood Mansion stood not as a monument to power but as a symbol of transformation and unity. The once imposing estate now hosted art exhibitions, charity events, and community celebrations. It became a place where stories were shared, talents were nurtured, and lives were uplifted. Beatrice's paintings were celebrated across the community, and she was often invited to speak about her journey of resilience. Ambrose continued to expand the foundation's reach, and Evangeline grew into a compassionate and confident young woman, determined to make a difference in the world. One evening, as the family gathered in the garden, the setting sun bathed the mansion in golden light. Beatrice looked around at the laughter and warmth that filled the air, her son's laughter, Nora's grandchildren playing, and Evangeline's excited chatter about her latest school project. She turned to Ambrose, her eyes shining. "You've given this family a second chance," she said softly.
"And I couldn't be prouder." Ambrose smiled, wrapping his arm around his mother. "No, Mom," he said. "We did this together." As the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, the Lockwood family sat together, united by the trials they had faced and the love that had carried them through. The mansion, once filled with shadows, now glowed with the light of hope, resilience, and a future filled with endless possibilities. The mansion becomes a beacon.
Over time, the Lockwood Mansion became a cornerstone of the community, its legacy evolving far beyond its original purpose. What had once been a symbol of wealth and exclusivity now stood as a beacon of hope and progress. Ambrose had the gates removed, replacing them with a welcoming arch inscribed with the words, "Where every voice is heard, and every hand is held." The once intimidating exterior of the mansion now invited people from all walks of life to step inside and feel at home.
Beatrice's gift to the community.
Beatrice, now in her late 70s, found a renewed purpose in using her art to inspire others. She organized workshops for elderly residents in the community, many of whom had long been neglected or forgotten. These sessions became a space for connection and healing, where stories of hardship were shared, and new friendships were formed. One of Beatrice's most celebrated works, a massive mural painted on the outer wall of the community center, depicted a phoenix rising from ashes. The vibrant colors and intricate details captured the essence of her journey and became a source of inspiration for everyone who saw it. At the unveiling ceremony, Ambrose stood beside his mother, his voice filled with emotion as he addressed the crowd. "This mural is not just a work of art," he said, gesturing to the magnificent piece.
"It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit. No matter how dark things may seem, we all have the power to rise again."
The applause that followed was deafening, and Beatrice, standing tall and proud, felt a deep sense of fulfillment.
Evangeline's transformation.
As Evangeline grew, she began to develop a keen interest in social justice and community welfare. Inspired by her father's work, she initiated her own project at the age of 16, called Seeds of Kindness. The initiative focused on creating community gardens in underprivileged areas, providing fresh produce to families in need while fostering a sense of unity. One day, while tending to a garden with a group of children, Evangeline was approached by a reporter who had heard about her work. "What drives you to do this?" the reporter asked, holding a microphone out to the teenager. Evangeline paused, her hands dirty from planting seeds, and looked directly into the camera.
"My father taught me that kindness is the strongest force in the world," she said. "And my grandmother showed me that even when life seems broken, we can always rebuild it. I want to be a part of that rebuilding."
Her words went viral, and Seeds of Kindness quickly gained national attention, drawing volunteers and funding from across the country.
Nora's role as a mentor.
Nora, now enjoying her well-earned retirement, became a mentor to the young staff at the community center. Her wisdom and warmth made her a beloved figure, and she was often sought out for advice.
One afternoon, a young single mother approached Nora during a workshop on parenting.
"Miss Nora," the woman began, her voice shaky, "how did you stay strong through everything you've been through?" Nora smiled gently, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's shoulder.
Strength doesn't come all at once, she said.
It's built, one small step at a time.
And it's okay to lean on others when you need to. None of us are meant to carry our burdens alone.
Her words resonated deeply, and the young mother left with a newfound sense of hope.
Ambrose's vision expands.
Ambrose, encouraged by the success of the Beatrice Aldrich Foundation, began working on expanding its reach internationally. He traveled to conferences, partnered with global organizations, and launched initiatives that address not just elder care but also education, healthcare, and housing for vulnerable populations. During one of these conferences in London, he delivered a powerful keynote speech about rebuilding trust after betrayal. His story of overcoming personal and familial turmoil to create something meaningful inspired countless attendees.
Afterward, a young entrepreneur approached him.
"Mr. Lockwood," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "your story changed the way I see my own challenges.
How did you find the courage to rebuild after everything?"
Ambrose smiled, his thoughts briefly drifting back to the darkest days of his life.
"Courage isn't about never being afraid," he replied.
"It's about taking one step forward, even when fear tells you to stop. And surrounding yourself with people who remind you why that step matters."
A family united.
Years later, on a warm summer evening, the Lockwood family gathered in the garden to celebrate Evangeline's college graduation.
The garden, once a space marked by tension and deceit, now overflowed with joy in life.
Strings of lights twinkled above, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming jasmine. Beatrice, now in her 80s, sat at the head of the table, her silver hair glowing in the soft light. Nora was beside her, laughing with Evangeline, whose achievements they were all so proud of. Ambrose stood to give a toast, his voice steady but filled with emotion.
"To family," he said, raising his glass. "To resilience, forgiveness, and love. We've faced storms together, but we've come out stronger.
And tonight, we celebrate not just Evangeline's success but the bond that holds us all together."
The glasses clinked, and the sound echoed in the night like a melody of unity and triumph.
As the evening drew to a close, Beatrice looked around at the faces of her family and friends.
The mansion, once a gilded prison, now felt like home again.
With a contented sigh, she whispered to herself, "We rose from the ashes
together."
The Lockwood story became a legacy of transformation, proving that even in the face of betrayal and hardship, love and resilience could triumph. The mansion stood not just as a home but as a symbol of hope for generations to come.